Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Mask of Ordinary. Curtis Berry adjusted his tie in the bathroom mirror of their suburban home in Denver, watching the reflection of a man who had spent 15 years perfecting the art of being invisible. At 42, he maintained the appearance of an unremarkable middle manager, pressed khakis, polo shirts, and a Honda Civic in the driveway. To his neighbors, he was just another face in the crowd, the quiet guy who mowed his lawn every Saturday and waved politely from his front porch. But Curtis Berry was far from ordinary. 20 years ago, he had been Curtis, the Ghost, Berry, the youngest lieutenant in the Romano crime family's Western operations. By 25, he controlled drug routes from Mexico to Canada, commanded respect through calculated brutality, and had eliminated more rivals than most men his age had job interviews. He had built an empire in shadows, amassed wealth that would make Wall Street executives weep, and earned a reputation that made hardened criminals cross themselves when they heard his name. Then he met Cecilia Curry at a charity fundraiser, a beautiful, ambitious attorney with honey-colored hair and green eyes that seemed to see straight through his carefully constructed facade. She was everything he thought he wanted: educated, refined, legitimate. For her, he had walked away from everything. He buried Curtis, the Ghost, Berry, so deep that even he sometimes forgot the man existed. He liquidated his operations, moved his money through untraceable channels, and assumed the identity of a mid-level insurance adjuster. The Romano family let him go. His loyalty and past services had earned him that much. But they never forgot, and neither did he. The networks remained intact, sleeping but never dead. Curtis had genuinely loved Cecilia. He gave her the life she wanted, the suburban house, the respectable husband, the social status that came with being Mrs. Berry. They had 2 children, Tracy, now 19 and away at college, and Cameron, 17 and still living at home. For 15 years, Curtis played his role perfectly, burying his true nature so deep that sometimes even he believed the lie. But lately, something had changed in Cecilia. She stayed late at the office more frequently, her phone was always face down, and she had started going to girls' nights that seemed to involve a lot of secretive phone calls. Curtis noticed everything. Observation was as natural to him as breathing, but he waited, watched, and hoped he was wrong. He wasn't. That evening, Curtis arrived home to find Cecilia applying makeup in front of the hallway mirror. She wore a black dress he'd never seen before, one that hugged her curves in a way that wasn't meant for book club meetings. "Another late client dinner?" Curtis asked, keeping his tone casual. Cecilia hummed without looking at him. "Big corporate merger. Could go very late." Curtis nodded, recognizing the lie with the same ease he'd once identified police informants. He had developed patience over the years, the kind that came from understanding that the best revenge was always worth waiting for. "I'll probably be asleep when you get home," he said, kissing her cheek. She smelled different, a new perfume, expensive and seductive. "Don't wait up," she replied, grabbing her purse and heading for the door. Curtis watched through the window as she drove away in her BMW, another gift from his hidden wealth that she believed came from his modest salary and smart investments. He waited exactly 30 minutes before making a phone call. "Marcus," he said when the familiar voice answered. "It's Ghost." There was a pause. Marcus Rodriguez had been Curtis's most trusted associate in the old days, now running security for several high-end establishments across the city. "Christ, Curtis. It's been years. What do you need?" "Surveillance. My wife. I need to know everything." "How detailed?" "Everything, Marcus. Where she goes, who she meets, what they order for dinner, and what room they book afterward. Consider it done. Like old times." Curtis looked around the house he'd built with blood money, at the family photos that might all be lies, at the life he'd constructed and carefully maintained for 15 years. Exactly like old times. Chapter 2. The Web Unravels. 3 days later, Marcus delivered a manila envelope that contained Curtis's worst fears in high-definition clarity. Photographs, video stills, credit card receipts, hotel registrations, a complete portfolio of betrayals spanning 8 months. Andrew Ferguson. Cecilia's affair partner was a 35-year-old commercial real estate developer with perfect teeth, expensive suits, and a reputation for closing deals with married women as much as with corporate clients. He drove a Porsche, lived in a downtown penthouse, and had the kind of confidence that came from never facing real consequences for his actions. Curtis studied each photograph with clinical detachment. Cecilia laughing in an upscale restaurant, her hand on Andrew's thigh. The two of them entering the Marriott downtown. Andrew's hand on the small of her back as they walked through a hotel lobby. Intimate moments that stripped away 15 years of marriage and revealed the cold truth beneath. But what cut deepest wasn't the betrayal itself. Curtis had survived worse treachery in his former life. It was the realization that Cecilia had never really known him at all. She was discarding what she saw as a boring, middle-class insurance adjuster for a flashier model. She had no idea she was throwing away a man who could have given her anything, who had already given her everything, and who possessed the power to destroy lives with a phone call. That evening, Curtis sat in his home office, a modest room with a desk from IKEA and financial planning books on the shelves. Behind a false panel he'd installed himself were items from his previous life. Untraceable phones, fake identification documents, and contact information for people who could make problems disappear permanently. He made several calls that night. The first was to a private investigator who specialized in the kind of detailed background work that could expose every secret a person had ever hidden. The second was to a lawyer in Las Vegas, not the kind who handled divorces, but the kind who handled the legal aftermath of situations that required cleanup. The third call was to Vincent Romano Jr., the current head of the family Curtis had once served. "Vincent, it's Curtis Berry. The ghost himself. I heard rumors you'd gone soft, playing house in suburbia." "Not soft, just patient. What do you need?" "Information on Andrew Ferguson. Commercial real estate, downtown Denver. And I need to know who he owes, who he's crossed, and who might be willing to sell him out for the right price. Consider it done. You coming back to the family business?" Curtis looked at the wedding photo on his desk, Cecilia in white, smiling at a man she'd never truly known. "No, this is personal." Chapter 3. The Expulsion. The confrontation came on a Tuesday evening in early October. Curtis had waited, gathering intelligence, building his case, and preparing for the moment when he would reveal what he knew. He planned to give Cecilia one chance, one opportunity to end the affair and return to their marriage. Not because he was weak, but because he wanted to see if the woman he'd loved for 15 years had any remnant of the person he thought he'd married. Cameron was at basketball practice when Curtis arrived home to find Cecilia pacing the living room, her phone pressed to her ear. She was speaking in low, intimate tones that immediately confirmed his suspicions. "I have to go," she whispered into the phone when she saw him. "He's home." Curtis set down his briefcase and looked at his wife of 15 years. "We need to talk." "About what?" Cecilia's voice carried the sharp edge of someone who'd already made her decision but hadn't yet found the courage to voice it. Curtis pulled out his phone and scrolled to the photos Marcus had provided. Without a word, he handed it to Cecilia. Her face went white, then red, then settled into defiant anger. "You had me followed? 8 months, Cecilia. 8 months you've been lying to my face, sleeping in our bed, and playing house while you've been." "While I've been what?" she snapped, her lawyer instincts kicking in. "While I've been trying to find some happiness with a man who actually has ambition, who doesn't spend his evenings reading insurance manuals and planning for retirement at 65. The words hit Curtis like physical blows, but he kept his expression neutral. "I've given you everything you wanted." "Everything?" Cecilia laughed bitterly. "You've given me mediocrity, Curtis. A suburban house, a middle-class life, and a husband who's content to be invisible forever. Andrew has vision. He has drive. He's going places." Curtis felt something cold and familiar settling in his chest, the same feeling he'd experienced years ago when he'd discovered that his lieutenant Tony Mazzone was skimming from the drug money and planning to testify against him. It was the moment when all emotion drained away, leaving only calculation and the certainty of what had to be done. "So end it," he said quietly. "Choose." Cecilia stared at him for a long moment, and Curtis saw her weighing her options. He could see her considering the comfortable life they'd built, the financial security, the social connections. For a moment, he thought she might choose their marriage. "I choose Andrew," she said finally. "I'm filing for divorce." Curtis nodded slowly. "I see. That's it. That's all you have to say." "What would you like me to say, Cecilia?" "Fight for me. Show some emotion. Prove that you're worth staying with." Curtis looked at his wife and realized that she had never seen him. Not really. She saw Curtis the insurance adjuster, Curtis the suburban husband, Curtis the man who grilled burgers on weekends and attended PTA meetings. She had never seen Curtis, the ghost, Barry, and now she never would. "I'm not going to beg," he said simply. The next morning, Curtis was awakened by shouting and the sound of objects hitting the driveway. He looked out the bedroom window to see Cecilia throwing his clothes from their bedroom window, her face twisted with rage. He dressed calmly, packed a single suitcase with essentials, and walked downstairs. Cecilia was standing by the front door, holding a manila envelope. "You're a worthless deadbeat," she screamed, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "This house and everything in it belongs to me now. I've filed the divorce." She thrust the divorce papers at his chest and slammed the door in his face. Curtis stood on the front porch for a moment, looking at the house he'd bought with money earned through violence and maintained through 15 years of careful deception. His neighbors were watching from their windows, probably feeling sorry for the quiet insurance man whose wife had finally had enough. "Very well," he said quietly to the closed door. Then Curtis Berry walked to his Honda Civic, drove to a downtown hotel, and began making phone calls that would change everything. Chapter 4. The Reckoning Begins. The Marriott downtown had a business center that Curtis had used many times during his years of maintaining his civilian facade. But today, he wasn't Curtis Berry, insurance adjuster. Today, he was making the kind of calls that required absolute privacy and untraceable connections. From his hotel room, Curtis opened a laptop that had never been connected to his home network. He accessed accounts that had remained dormant for 15 years, accounts in banks that didn't ask questions, investment portfolios managed by firms that specialized in discretion, and properties owned through shell corporations that had no apparent connection to Curtis Berry. The first revelation would have staggered anyone who knew him as a middle-class insurance worker. Curtis was worth approximately $47 million. Money earned through 15 years of drug operations, arms deals, and various enterprises that existed in the shadows of legitimate business. Money that had been cleaned, invested, and multiplied through careful management and the kind of opportunities that came from having connections in both criminal and legitimate enterprises. The second revelation was more dangerous. Curtis had never truly left his old life behind. He had simply put it to sleep, maintaining relationships and connections that could be activated when needed. The Romano family still considered him an associate. His network of contacts, forgers, enforcers, hackers, and fixers remained loyal and available. Curtis's first call was to Elena Vasquez, a real estate attorney who had helped him acquire properties under various corporate names. Within an hour, she had prepared documents that would devastate Cecilia's understanding of her own life. "The house is owned by Mountain View Holdings, LLC," Elena explained over the phone. "A corporation that's been paying the mortgage, taxes, and insurance for 15 years. Cecilia Berry has never been an owner, never been a signatory, and has no legal claim to the property. And Mountain View Holdings is owned by a subsidiary of Romano Investment Partners, which is owned by Curtis Berry," he finished. Among other identities, Curtis had spent 15 years allowing Cecilia to believe they were building something together, when in reality, everything, the house, the cars, the investments, belonged to him through a web of corporations and legal structures she could never have imagined. His second call was to Marcus Rodriguez. "I need a crew," Curtis said. "Professional, discreet, and willing to send a message." "What kind of message?" "The kind Andrew Ferguson will understand perfectly." Curtis's plan was elegantly simple. Andrew Ferguson had built his real estate empire on borrowed money, leveraged deals, and the kind of financial maneuvering that looked brilliant in a rising market but became catastrophic when the wrong pressure was applied. Curtis was going to apply that pressure systematically and without mercy. Vincent Romano Jr. had provided detailed intelligence on Andrew's business operations. The man was leveraged to the hilt, with several major deals dependent on financing that could disappear with the right phone calls. He owed money to the wrong people, not criminals, but wealthy investors who had the power to destroy him financially if they lost confidence in his abilities. But Curtis wasn't interested in mere financial destruction. That was too clean, too distant. He wanted Andrew Ferguson to understand exactly what happened when someone took something that belonged to Curtis Berry. The next morning, Curtis hired a luxury car service and rode to his old suburban neighborhood in a black Escalade with tinted windows. He wore a suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary and carried documents that would reshape his wife's understanding of reality. The Escalade pulled into the driveway of the house Curtis owned, but had allowed Cecilia to believe was theirs. Marcus Rodriguez and another man in expensive suits, both carrying themselves with the quiet confidence of professional enforcers, approached the front door. Curtis remained in the vehicle, watching through the tinted windows as they knocked. Cecilia answered the door in her bathrobe, her hair disheveled, clearly not expecting visitors. Curtis could see her confusion turn to concern as she looked at the two men who didn't fit the usual pattern of suburban visitors. Marcus handed her a single document, a legal notice of eviction and a court order granting immediate possession of the property to Mountain View Holdings, LLC. Even from the car, Curtis could see Cecilia's face go white as she read the document. He watched her mouth form words he couldn't hear but could easily imagine. This can't be true. He owned. What the hell? Marcus spoke to her briefly, probably explaining that she had 24 hours to remove her personal belongings and that any attempt to remain on the property would result in her arrest for trespassing. Curtis had given her 15 years of comfortable lies. Now she would learn the truth about the man she had betrayed and discarded. But this was only the beginning. Cecilia's humiliation and Andrew Ferguson's destruction were going to be a masterpiece of revenge, crafted with the patience and precision that had once made Curtis Berry the most feared lieutenant in the Romano organization. The old Curtis was awakening, and he had 15 years of suppressed fury to unleash. Chapter 5. The Network Awakens. Andrew Ferguson's penthouse apartment occupied the top 2 floors of a gleaming downtown tower that he'd helped develop. That evening, as he and Cecilia celebrated what they believed was her liberation from a boring marriage, they had no idea they were being watched by professionals who could move through a building like ghosts. Curtis sat in a rented office space across the street, watching through high-powered binoculars as his targets toasted their future together. Cecilia wore a red dress that probably cost more than her cheating heart deserved, while Andrew poured champagne that he would soon discover he could no longer afford. Phase 1 is complete, Marcus reported, entering the office with a file folder. Your wife received the eviction notice. She's been making frantic phone calls to lawyers all afternoon. And Ferguson? 3 of his major investors received anonymous tips about his personal conduct and financial irregularities. The Pemberton Group is demanding an immediate audit of his accounts, and Metropolitan Bank is reviewing his credit lines. Curtis smiled, not the pleasant expression of Curtis Berry, suburban husband, but the cold calculation of Curtis, the ghost Berry, the man who had once made grown killers tremble. Continue. Marcus opened the file. We've also identified Ferguson's pressure points. He owes significant money to Vincent Carbone, not our Vincent, but Vincent Carbone from the Chicago outfit. Gambling debts from private poker games. About $300,000. Interesting. And his family. Parents deceased. One sister, Allison Ferguson. She's a teacher in Colorado Springs. Clean, no criminal connections, but she co-signed for his first business loan 5 years ago. She's still liable for about $2 million if his companies default. Curtis absorbed this information with the same clinical precision he'd once used to plan territory expansions and rival eliminations. Andrew Ferguson wasn't just going to lose his money and his reputation. He was going to watch everyone he cared about suffer for his decision to pursue another man's wife. What about the children? Marcus asked carefully. Curtis paused. Tracy and Cameron were his biological children, but they had sided with their mother immediately after the divorce filing. Tracy had called him a pathetic loser who couldn't even keep his wife happy, while Cameron had refused to speak to him entirely. The betrayal cut deep, but Curtis had learned long ago that blood meant nothing when weighed against loyalty. They made their choice, Curtis said finally. They chose her side without knowing the facts. They'll learn the consequences of choosing poorly. That night, Curtis activated networks that had been dormant for 15 years. A call to Jimmy Torino in Las Vegas resulted in Andrew Ferguson's gambling markers being sold to less understanding creditors. A conversation with Sandra Welsh, a financial journalist, led to questions being asked about Andrew's business practices and romantic entanglements with married clients. But the most devastating move was personal. Curtis had discovered that Andrew Ferguson maintained a secret that could destroy him even more thoroughly than financial ruin. Through careful investigation, Curtis learned that Andrew had been married before, to a woman named Rachel Manning, whom he had abandoned when she was diagnosed with cancer 3 years earlier. Not only had he left her, but he had hidden assets during their divorce, leaving her with enormous medical bills while he maintained his lifestyle. Rachel Manning was now living in a modest apartment, working as a part-time bookkeeper despite ongoing chemotherapy treatments. She had tried to pursue legal action against Andrew, but lacked the resources to fight his expensive lawyers. Curtis arranged to meet Rachel at a coffee shop near the hospital where she received treatment. "Mrs. Manning," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "My name is Curtis Berry. I'd like to help you get justice from your ex-husband." Rachel was a fragile-looking woman in her early 30s, but her eyes held a hardness that Curtis recognized, the look of someone who had been betrayed and abandoned when they needed support most. "I can't afford another lawyer," she said quietly. "I'm not a lawyer, but I have resources that can help you recover what he stole from you." Curtis slid a business card across the table, not his insurance company card, but one that listed him as a consultant for Mountain View Holdings. "Andrew Ferguson destroyed your life for his own convenience. Would you like to return the favor?" 2 hours later, Rachel Manning walked out of that coffee shop with a check for $50,000 to cover her immediate medical expenses and a promise that Andrew Ferguson would pay for every moment of suffering he had caused her. Curtis had just recruited his most powerful weapon in the war against Andrew Ferguson, a wronged woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain from her ex-husband's destruction. The pieces were falling into place, and Curtis, the ghost, Berry, was remembering why he had once been the most feared man in the Romano organization. Chapter 6. The First Blood. Andrew Ferguson's world began crumbling on a Wednesday morning when he arrived at his office to find FBI agents executing a search warrant. The anonymous tip about financial irregularities had triggered a federal investigation into his business practices, and his computers, files, and records were being seized as evidence. Curtis watched the chaos from across the street, sipping coffee and feeling the familiar satisfaction of a plan executed perfectly. The FBI wouldn't find evidence of major crimes. Andrew was greedy and unethical, but not criminally sophisticated. But the investigation would destroy his reputation and trigger the financial cascade that Curtis had carefully orchestrated. By noon, 3 major clients had canceled contracts worth over $8 million. The Metropolitan Bank had frozen his credit lines pending the outcome of the federal investigation. The Pemberton Group had demanded immediate repayment of loans that Andrew couldn't possibly cover without liquidating assets that were already leveraged to other creditors. But the personal destruction was even more satisfying. Rachel Manning held a press conference outside Andrew's office building, flanked by reporters who had received anonymous tips about her story. She looked fragile but determined as she detailed how Andrew had hidden assets during their divorce, leaving her to face cancer treatments alone while he pursued an affair with a married woman. "Andrew Ferguson is a man who abandons everyone who needs him," Rachel told the cameras. "He left me when I was fighting for my life, and now he's doing the same thing to another man's family. Women like Cecilia Berry should know exactly what kind of man they're involved with." The footage would be broadcast on local news that evening, and Curtis had ensured that copies would find their way to Cecilia's law firm, her social circle, and anyone else who might be interested in her judgment and character. Meanwhile, Cecilia was discovering that her comfortable life had been built on foundations she had never understood. The house was gone, the cars were being repossessed by companies she'd never heard of, and the bank accounts she thought were joint assets had been revealed as sole proprietorships belonging to her estranged husband. She had moved in with Andrew temporarily, but his penthouse apartment was about to be seized by creditors. They were both learning that their passionate romance looked much less appealing when viewed from the ruins of their respective lives. That evening, Curtis received a call from Vincent Romano Jr. "Your boy Ferguson is in deep trouble," Vincent reported. "Vincent Carbone from Chicago is very unhappy about his gambling debts. Word is, he's planning to send some people to Denver to collect." "How unfortunate," Curtis said without any trace of sympathy. "You want us to intervene?" "No. Let Carbone handle his business. But make sure Ferguson understands that his problems are just beginning." Curtis had spent years learning that the most effective revenge was comprehensive. It wasn't enough to destroy someone financially. You had to dismantle their entire life, piece by piece, until they understood the full scope of their mistake. Andrew Ferguson was about to learn that lesson in excruciating detail. The next morning, Curtis made a visit that would have been impossible for Curtis Berry, insurance adjuster, but was effortless for Curtis, the ghost Berry, former lieutenant of the Romano family. He walked into the downtown office building where Cecilia worked as a partner in a prestigious law firm. The security guards didn't stop him. His expensive suit, confident bearing, and the two men who accompanied him suggested someone with legitimate business and dangerous connections. Curtis found Cecilia in her office, frantically making phone calls to try to salvage her situation. She looked up as he entered, and for the first time in 15 years, she saw her husband without the mask of suburban mediocrity. "Hello, Cecilia," Curtis said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "We need to talk." Cecilia stared at him, noting the expensive suit, the confident posture, and something in his eyes that she had never seen before, something cold and calculating that made her suddenly afraid. "Who are you?" she whispered. Curtis smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "I'm your husband," he said. "I'm just not the man you thought you married." Chapter 7. The True Face Revealed. Cecilia's office felt smaller than usual as Curtis leaned back in his chair, studying his wife with the same detached interest he'd once reserved for business rivals who needed to be eliminated. The two men who had accompanied him, Marcus and another associate named Willie Wilkerson, stood silently by the door, their presence both protective and threatening. 15 years, Curtis said conversationally. 15 years I gave you everything you wanted. The house, the cars, the social status, the comfortable life. And you threw it away for a mediocre real estate developer with a gambling problem and a history of abandoning women when they need him most. Curtis, I don't understand what's happening. The house, the money. The money was always mine, Cecilia. The house was always mine. Everything you thought we built together? I built it. I paid for it. I owned it. Curtis's voice remained calm, but there was an underlying hardness that made Cecilia shrink back in her chair. You were living in my world, spending my money, and enjoying the benefits of my generosity. And when you decided you wanted something different, you didn't have the courtesy to ask for a divorce like a civilized person. Instead, you decided to humiliate me, discard me, and steal from me. Steal? I never. You tried to claim half of everything in the divorce. Half of assets that you never owned, never earned, and never even understood. Curtis leaned forward slightly. Do you want to know where the money came from, Cecilia? Do you want to know how your suburban husband was able to afford the life you demanded? Cecilia stared at him, beginning to realize that the man sitting across from her was not the same person she had lived with for 15 years. Curtis pulled out his phone and showed her a photograph, a newspaper clipping from 22 years ago. The headline read, Romano Lieutenant Suspected in Rival Gang Elimination. The photo showed a younger Curtis in handcuffs, his face partially obscured but clearly recognizable. Curtis, the ghost Berry, he said quietly. I ran drug operations from Denver to Seattle. I controlled territory worth millions of dollars. I eliminated people who crossed me, and I built an empire that made me wealthy beyond anything your lawyer's salary could ever achieve. Cecilia's face went white. You're lying. Am I? Curtis scrolled through more photos on his phone, images of money transfers, property deeds, corporate documents that traced back to shell companies with connections to organized crime. Every dollar you spent, every comfort you enjoyed, every bit of social status you treasured, it all came from blood money, Cecilia. You've been living off the proceeds of violence for 15 years, and you never even knew it. I would never have. You would never have what? Married me? Taken the money? Enjoyed the lifestyle? Curtis's smile was sharp and cold. You did all of those things, Cecilia. You just didn't bother to ask where it came from. As long as the checks cleared and the bills were paid, you were happy to remain ignorant. Marcus stepped forward and placed a manila envelope on Cecilia's desk. Financial records, he said simply. Everything your husband bought, every payment he made, every dollar that funded your comfortable life. All traced back to criminal enterprises. Cecilia opened the envelope with shaking hands, scanning documents that detailed money transfers, property purchases, and investment portfolios that painted a picture of wealth far beyond anything she had imagined. Why are you showing me this? She whispered. Because I want you to understand what you threw away, Curtis said. And I want you to understand what happens to people who betray me. Curtis stood up, smoothing his jacket. Andrew Ferguson is about to learn some very hard lessons about choosing the wrong woman and making the wrong enemies. His business is collapsing, his debts are being called in, and some very dangerous people are looking for him. You chose to tie your future to his, which means you're going to suffer right alongside him. Curtis, please. My children have also chosen poorly, Curtis continued, ignoring her plea. Tracy called me a pathetic loser. Cameron won't even speak to me. They decided that their cheating mother was more worthy of their loyalty than the father who provided everything they ever had. They'll learn the cost of that decision. Cecilia was crying now, but Curtis felt no sympathy. He had offered her a chance to end the affair and preserve their marriage, and she had chosen humiliation and betrayal instead. What do you want? She asked. I want you to understand that you never knew me at all, Curtis said. And I want you to watch everything you value disappear, piece by piece, until you're left with nothing but the knowledge that you brought this on yourself. Curtis walked toward the door, then paused and looked back. Oh, and Cecilia? You might want to find somewhere else to stay tonight. Andrew's apartment is about to become very dangerous for anyone who happens to be there. He left her sitting in her office, surrounded by the evidence of a life built on illusions and sustained by the generosity of a man she had never bothered to truly know. Chapter 8. The Trap Springs. Andrew Ferguson's penthouse had become a fortress of desperation. FBI agents had seized his office, creditors were demanding immediate payment, and the Chicago associates of Vincent Carbone had made it clear that his gambling debts would be collected one way or another. But Andrew still believed he could salvage the situation if he could just find the right leverage, make the right deal, or convince the right people to give him more time. He was wrong. Curtis had spent 3 weeks orchestrating a symphony of destruction that was about to reach its crescendo. Every move had been calculated, every pressure point identified and exploited, every escape route systematically blocked. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Curtis had used his connections to purchase Andrew's gambling debts from Vincent Carbone, along with several other significant obligations that Andrew owed to various creditors. Legally and quietly, Curtis now owned Andrew Ferguson, every asset, every debt, and every aspect of his rapidly collapsing empire. On a Thursday evening, as Andrew and Cecilia huddled in his penthouse apartment trying to plan their next move, Curtis arrived with an entourage that would have made the Romano family proud. Marcus Rodriguez, Willie Wilkerson, and 3 other associates dressed in expensive suits and carrying themselves with the quiet confidence of professional enforcers. The building's security guards didn't stop them. Curtis had purchased the building through one of his shell corporations 2 days earlier. Andrew answered the door with the kind of false bravado that desperate men adopted when they knew they were cornered but refused to admit it. What the hell do you want? Andrew demanded, trying to block the doorway. Curtis smiled and handed him a legal document. I'm here to collect what you owe me. Andrew scanned the papers, his face going pale as he realized what he was reading. This is impossible. These debts belong to. They belong to various creditors who were willing to sell them to me at a significant discount, Curtis said calmly. Approximately $7 million in total obligations, all now owned by Mountain View Holdings, LLC, which is owned by me. Cecilia appeared behind Andrew, still beautiful, but showing the strain of the past few weeks. When she saw Curtis, she immediately understood that their situation had just become exponentially worse. Curtis, please, she said. We can work something out. We had a deal for 15 years, Cecilia. You broke it when you decided to sleep with him. Curtis gestured to Andrew with casual contempt. Now you can both live with the consequences. Andrew's desperation finally overcame his fear. You can't do this. I'll fight you in court. I'll expose you. Curtis laughed, a sound devoid of humor that made both Andrew and Cecilia step back involuntarily. Expose me? To whom? With what evidence? Using what resources? Curtis pulled out his phone and showed Andrew a series of photographs. These are pictures of your sister Allison leaving her school yesterday. She looks worried, probably because she just learned that she's liable for $2 million in loans that you defaulted on. My associates are very good at tracking down people who owe money. Andrew's face went white. Leave my sister out of this. Your sister involved herself when she co-signed your loans. Just like Cecilia involved herself when she chose to sleep with a man who owed me millions of dollars. Curtis's voice remained conversational, but the threat was unmistakable. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to sign over every asset you own to pay down your debts. The penthouse, the cars, the investment accounts, everything. And then you're going to disappear from Denver and never come back. And if I refuse? Marcus stepped forward, reaching inside his jacket just enough to reveal the handle of a pistol. Then we handle this the old-fashioned way. Curtis had no intention of actually harming Andrew or Cecilia. That would have been inefficient and unnecessarily risky. But they didn't know that, and their fear was almost as satisfying as their destruction. You have 24 hours to liquidate everything and transfer the proceeds to accounts I specify, Curtis continued. Miss the deadline, and my associates will begin collecting from your sister, your friends, and anyone else who might be able to help cover your debts. Andrew signed the papers with shaking hands. But Curtis wasn't finished. Oh, and Andrew, the gambling debts from Chicago? Those are still your problem. Vincent Carbone isn't as reasonable as I am. He expects his money in cash, and he doesn't accept property transfers or payment plans. Curtis had orchestrated the perfect trap. Andrew Ferguson would lose everything to Curtis through legal debt collection, and then face additional pressure from Chicago creditors who would demand payment he no longer had the ability to provide. As Curtis and his associates prepared to leave, Cecilia grabbed his arm. What about Tracy and Cameron? She asked desperately. Curtis looked at her with the same cold detachment he'd once reserved for business rivals who had outlived their usefulness. They chose you over me, he said simply. They can live with the consequences of that choice. From now on, they're on their own. Curtis Berry, both the suburban insurance adjuster and Curtis, the ghost Berry, was officially dead. What remained was something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. A man who had given everything for love and received betrayal in return. Chapter 9. The Final Reckoning. 6 months later, Curtis Berry sat in his new office, a gleaming suite on the top floor of a downtown Denver high-rise that he owned through a web of legitimate corporations. The insurance adjuster was gone forever, replaced by a consultant who specialized in problem resolution for clients who could afford discretion and results. The city spread out below him like a chessboard where he had systematically captured every piece that mattered. Andrew Ferguson had fled Denver 2 weeks after signing over his assets, but Vincent Carbone's people had tracked him to Phoenix. The collection process had been brutal but efficient. Andrew now worked as a night shift security guard in a warehouse, living in a studio apartment and sending every spare dollar to pay down debts that would keep him in poverty for the rest of his life. His sister Allison had lost her house and was living with relatives, still liable for loans that her brother could never repay. Cecilia had fared no better. Her law firm had quietly suggested that she find other employment after the FBI investigation into Andrew's finances had revealed her romantic involvement with a client under federal scrutiny. She now worked for a small firm that handled personal injury cases and divorce proceedings, a far cry from the prestigious corporate practice she had once enjoyed. The house in the suburbs stood empty, a monument to broken promises and misplaced trust. Curtis had considered selling it, but decided to keep it as a reminder of the 15 years he had spent living someone else's definition of success. But the most painful casualties were Tracy and Cameron. Tracy had called him 3 months earlier, her voice shaking as she explained that her college fund had disappeared along with everything else. She couldn't afford tuition, couldn't get student loans without a cosigner, and couldn't understand how her father, whom she had dismissed as a pathetic loser, had managed to destroy her future so completely. "Dad, please," she had begged. "I know I said some terrible things, but I was angry and confused. Mom told us you were having a breakdown, that you were being unreasonable about the divorce. We didn't know. You didn't want to know," Curtis had replied quietly. "You chose to believe her lies rather than ask me for the truth. You called me pathetic without understanding anything about who I am or what I've done for this family. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Dad. Please, I'll do anything." "The time for apologies was before you chose sides," Curtis had said, and then he hung up. Cameron had been even more devastating. At 17, he was old enough to understand the full scope of what had happened, but young enough to still need his father's support. He had attempted suicide 2 months earlier, a desperate act that had landed him in psychiatric care and left him broken in ways that might never fully heal. Curtis had visited him once in the hospital, looking at his son through bulletproof glass and feeling something crack inside his chest. Cameron had aged years in a matter of months, his face gaunt and his eyes hollow with the kind of despair that came from watching everything you believed about your life revealed as a lie. Why? Cameron had whispered through the intercom. Why did you let us hate you? Why didn't you tell us the truth? Because I wanted you to choose me based on who I was to you, not what I could give you, Curtis had replied. And you chose your mother instead. We were kids. We didn't understand. You're 17, Cameron, old enough to make choices and live with the consequences. Curtis had left the hospital that day knowing that he would never see his son again. Cameron would grow up in poverty, scarred by his father's betrayal and his mother's lies. And Curtis would live with the knowledge that his need for revenge had destroyed the two people he loved most in the world. But Curtis, the ghost, Barry had learned long ago that some prices were worth paying, and some betrayals could never be forgiven. A knock at his office door interrupted his thoughts. Marcus Rodriguez entered, carrying a file folder and wearing the kind of expression that suggested important news. Vincent Carbone's people found Andrew Ferguson, Marcus reported. Phoenix police are calling it a robbery gone wrong, but we both know better. Curtis nodded without emotion. Andrew Ferguson's death was unfortunate, but predictable. Men who owed money to the Chicago outfit rarely lived long enough to pay their debts in full. And Mrs. Barry? Working for a firm that handles slip-and-fall cases. Living in a one-bedroom apartment in Aurora. She's gained weight, drinks too much, and spends her evenings calling men from dating websites who never call her back. The children. Tracy dropped out of school and is working at a restaurant in Fort Collins. Cameron is living in a group home for troubled teens. Neither of them has tried to contact you in over 2 months. Curtis absorbed this information with the same clinical detachment he'd once used to evaluate enemy territory. His family was destroyed, scattered to the winds like debris from an explosion. Andrew Ferguson was dead. And Curtis Barry, both versions of him, had won completely. So why did victory taste like ashes? Curtis walked to the window and looked out at the city he now controlled from the shadows. He had money, power, respect, and the kind of reputation that made dangerous people step aside when he walked into a room. He had everything he'd once possessed as Curtis, the ghost Barry, plus the wisdom that came from 15 years of hiding among ordinary people. But he was utterly alone. His phone buzzed with a text message from Tracy. Dad, please. I'm pregnant, and I have nowhere to go. I know I don't deserve your help, but the baby didn't choose any of this. Curtis stared at the message for a long time, feeling something that might have been his conscience stirring after months of ruthless calculation. His daughter was carrying his grandchild, a new life that bore no responsibility for the betrayals and broken promises that had destroyed their family. For a moment, Curtis considered calling her back. He imagined offering her a place to stay, helping her through the pregnancy, perhaps even rebuilding some small portion of the relationship they had once shared. He had the money and resources to make her life comfortable, and maybe, just maybe, he could find some redemption in protecting his grandchild from the consequences of his revenge. Then Curtis remembered the sound of Tracy's voice when she called him a pathetic loser. He remembered Cameron's refusal to speak to him, and Cecilia's look of contempt when she chose Andrew Ferguson over 15 years of marriage. Curtis deleted the message without responding. He had learned the most important lesson of his life. Forgiveness was a luxury that Curtis, the ghost, Barry could not afford. He had built his empire on the principle that betrayal had consequences, and he would not compromise that principle for anyone, not for his wife, not for his children, and not for a grandchild he would never meet. Curtis Barry was finally free. Free from the illusions of suburban happiness, free from the burden of pretending to be someone he wasn't, and free from the weakness that had made him vulnerable to betrayal. He was also utterly, irrevocably alone. As the sun set over Denver, Curtis poured himself a glass of expensive whiskey and toasted his victory. He had destroyed everyone who had crossed him, protected his empire, and proven that Curtis, the ghost, Barry was not a man who could be discarded and forgotten. The revenge was complete, the justice was absolute, and the cost was everything that had ever mattered to him. Curtis Barry had won, and in winning, he had lost himself forever.